So if you watched my previous video, you'll know that this year has been one of the more unproductive reading years for me. I read 26 books this year, which is about a third of the number of books I read last year, and then half of the number of books I read the year before that. So, not amazing, but also like I'm not mad at it, because I feel like this year I've had a lot going on. So the fact that I have any books at all to tell you to read right now is a good sign. The first thing I'd like to say, I actually haven't mentioned this before, which I should have mentioned because of how soon it is, but anyway, I'll mention it now. Me and Steph from Stephanie Bookish will be hosting a read along this year, and by this year I mean like literally next month. So we will be reading the Red Rising trilogy by Did I almost say Piers Morgan? I'm so sorry, Piers Brown. Okay, we're going to be doing a read along of Red Rising, but the first trilogy. I've heard it's a Hunger Games meet something else, like in space. We're going to be reading this in January. Neither of us have started this yet. We're going to be reading it in January, and then the live show will be in February on my channel. And then in February we'll be reading the second book, Morning Star, I want to say, or Golden Sun. I don't know the order. And then we're going to have the live show on Steph's channel. Basically, I'll keep you guys updated, but the point is, we're going to be doing this live show in February, okay? Early February, so make sure you join us. If this is on your TBR, pick it up like right now. And if you've been meaning to reread it, then please, like, join us, okay? Once we read the first 3 books, we're going to decide whether we want to continue with the series. I have all the books here, so Steph and I we better love it. So please join us in this read along, it'll be so much fun. So let's get into the best books of the year. Usually I do 10 books a year and I actually rank them, but this year I have 5. These 5 books are amazing, spectacular, show-stopping, and I'm not going to rank them this time, so I honestly can't. These 5 books have given me that best feeling, you know, like in my heart. But there were 2 books that were so close, but they didn't quite make it. Like, they were amazing. 5 out of 5 stars, brilliant, but I don't think they were quite like in my heart for best books of the year, but I feel like I definitely need to mention them. So these are the 2 honorary mentions of the year. So a book that you've seen on BookTube probably a million times this year, but I feel like with good reason. I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jeanette McCurdy. If you watched iCarly when you were younger, you'll know that Jeanette McCurdy was Sam from iCarly. In this book, she's basically talking about growing up with an emotionally abusive and controlling mother, being in the child acting industry, which is honestly horrifying. Her past relationships, her eating disorders, her being in therapy. Like, this book really digs deep into what she went through. When I tell you this book was so well written, it really just gets you. I will warn you, like, it's kind of graphic and difficult to read at times. The way it's written, it's half of the book is written before her mum dies and the other half is written after her mum dies, and in the first half, even the way she writes it, it's just so like high level. It's almost like she's narrating it, her as a child, being naive and believing everything her mum's telling her. It's written in that way, and then once her mum dies, she's starting to realise how abusive her mum was. She was kind of blindly following her mum, and then later on when her mum dies, she's starting to process these emotions and all this pent up like anger that she had, and it's just wow. I recommend listening to the audiobook because she narrates it. So the next book I want to talk about, it's really popular on BookTube, and I'm so glad that I came across this series. This is one of those series I don't think I would ever find if it wasn't for BookTube, so I'm very glad I'm in this community. Jade War by Fonda Lee. Please ignore how damaged it is. Yeah, it's been soaked. I'm not going to get into the details because it makes me look really bad, but anyway, Jade War is the second book in a trilogy called the Greenbone Saga, and it's basically a high fantasy set in a fictional place that's very similar to Hong Kong. So there are these gangs that rule this country called Keegan, and there's 2 main really big clans. And I forgot to explain Jade. Jade is like literally the whole premise of this. Jade is like jade stone, you know, jade, but in this world it has powers, and a lot of people will wear jade, and it's like a symbol of like high power and high class, and the more jade you have, obviously the more powerful you look and the more people respect you. It gives you these abilities like it makes you really strong, it makes you fast, and like you can jump really high, and basically it makes you like superhuman. So the people that wear jade are greenbones, the people who rule the clans are greenbones. In this book it just expands a bit more, just gets bigger. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you read this book you know what I'm talking about, but it just like it feels a bit bigger. I feel like this book was just quite non-stop compared to the first book. So anyway, I love this, and I'm currently reading Jade Legacy. Every book has made me cry in this series so far, and Jade Legacy, I'm just scared for my life. I'm just constantly on edge when I read her books, and she just... So, highly recommend. This series is great. Now that the honorary mentions are done, let's get into the 5 books that like really stuck out to me. So the first book was actually a book that I read in my last vlog. It was a reread, and that book is Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nevo. It's really tiny, okay? It's 100 pages, it's a fantasy book, and it's just so beautifully written. I read this last year, and I remember I read this with Dana, and me and Dana, when we were reading it the entire time, we were both so confused. But I just remember I was here for the vibes and the writing and the story, and it was just so beautifully written. This time I reread it, and I just feel like it just got to that next level because I feel like I understood it more, and it was just an amazing time. So basically what this book is about is set in this world where there's these people called clerics. They shave their heads, they wear these robes, and they go around and they collect information, like stories about people's pasts, important people's pasts, and they like file it away. So they're really important. In the beginning of the story, we're following this cleric called Chi, and they go to this abandoned palace by a lake, and they want to collect like information about the old empress, but then they end up meeting this old lady who actually worked in that palace and worked for the empress. In chapters, in short parts, you get little bits of the story of the empress through Rabbit, who's this old lady, and the relationship those two had. It is just so beautiful. Like, she was a foreign empress who was married off unwillingly, and then she was cast aside, so she's living in this palace, really lonely, so far from home, and her only friend is Rabbit, who's this old lady, and she works for her, and it's just so beautiful. It's so empowering as well. Okay, the next book I want to talk about is a book I read, literally the first book of the year, but as soon as I read it I knew it was going to be my favourite books of the year, and that is Last Argument of Kings. This is the third book in the First Law trilogy. This is the end of the first trilogy. By the way, I highly recommend the audiobook because the audiobook narrator is so funny. I feel like he really conveys the stupidity and ridiculousness of these characters. But let me tell you a bit about this. It's a grimdark fantasy. It's set in this really bleak world, and it follows these 3 or 4 main characters. One of them is this guy who was like a war hero, but then he got taken by the other side and he was tortured, and now he's like completely disfigured. He can barely walk, he's in pain all the time. His internal dialogue is actually so funny. Anyway, this character Glockter is now a torturer. He's just so funny. He's just a horrible person. All these characters are horrible. There's this other guy called Logan. He's this rough northern, they consider them barbarians. There's a very interesting storyline with him. And there's this other character, he's very ridiculous. In his internal monologue is also hilarious because he's so up his own arse. These characters are obviously so ridiculous and so horrible, but somehow you just root for them. This journey was so enjoyable. Like, the second book in the series made it to my best books of last year video. I just love this book. I love how it wrapped up. It really is one of my favourite series of all time now. I will say, I will warn you, the first book appears to have absolutely no plot, and now that I've read all 3 of them, I know that there's a lot of setup going on, but you won't know that, so you're just there for the vibe. So you just have to be there for the characters and just the writing, because Joe Abercrombie is so funny. Like, the way he writes is just... And then the second book, I would say, is when the plot starts coming together, but also the characters, like, you become more attached to the characters, they become more interesting. And then this book is like all plot. It's a lot of plot, a lot of fighting, a lot of action. It's just really good. Highly recommend. Okay, another book that I heard a lot of people talking about last year, I want to say. I think it came out in 2021. This book was so hyped in 2021. I remember it was in a lot of people's best books of the year video, and now it's in mine. Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, and this is the first Andy Weir I've read. I remember The Martian was really big when it came out, but I don't know, I had no interest in reading The Martian, but somehow, even though people were not telling me a lot about the plot of this book, I had a feeling in my heart that I would love it. And I was right. It's a sci-fi book, and it starts with this guy who just wakes up in a spaceship in the middle of space and has no recollection of who he is, what he's doing in the middle of space, and slowly his memory comes back to him. He's starting to remember who he is and why he was sent out here. It's just so fun. This book, like, is so easy to read, by the way, so accessible. Considering, like, I don't read that much sci-fi, I feel like this was so easy to read. It flips back and forth between present day him, like him in space, and then him remembering certain events. And I think that if it wasn't written like that, like if he had all his memory, just him with his memory doing this task that he was sent out here to do, I don't think it would be nearly as fun. But this was a really good time. It's almost like you're figuring it out with him, so it's just a fun time. I think I've heard some people call this a thriller, and it's definitely not a thriller. I would describe this as a cozy, fun sci-fi. It's just so unexpectedly wholesome, this book. It wasn't what I was expecting, but I also loved it just as much as I was expecting to. Does that make sense? I will also say that this book is really sciencey. It's sciencey in a way that's really fun to read about. I feel like if this guy was my physics teacher in school, I think I would have enjoyed physics a lot more than I did. If you're in a reading slump as well, I recommend this because it's so easy to read. The next book I'll talk about, I don't have a physical copy of. That book is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. I discovered Emily Henry last year, 2022. That was my first experience with Emily Henry, and it started off with You and Me on Vacation. I always call it People We Meet on Vacation because of you guys, because of Americans. I have a vlog if you want to watch it. I absolutely fell in love with this book. It was so beautiful. But then I read Book Lovers by Emily Henry, and it just absolutely blew me away. If you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know that I've been on a journey to find my favourite romance book. When it comes to rom-coms, I eat them up. Obviously there are a lot of shit rom-coms, but there are so many that I absolutely love, and rom-coms are just my favourite genre. So it doesn't make sense that romance books are my favourite genre. Up until I read Book Lovers, I hadn't found romance that I was like, this is the best of the best. This is the best thing ever. I love it so much. This is my favourite thing. It is probably on absolutely everyone's best books of the year video, with good reason. Basically, it follows Nora and Charlie. I feel like this book is just a complete subversion of all the tropes that are typical in romance. It kind of is taking the piss out of itself. So it follows this girl called Nora. She is a literary agent and she's described as a shark because she's so cutthroat and so good at her job. She's such a girl boss. She goes to this small town with her sister and romance ensues, but not with the typical hot local guy, as you will. She even goes on a date with the typical local guy. The guy that she has a romance with is also another city publishing person. He's an editor, and they were both at each other's necks. But also, even the enemies to lovers trope wasn't taken too seriously. They didn't like each other at first. They had a bad first interaction. With a lot of romances that do enemies to lovers, they have this, oh, I don't like him for so long, that it's like, but you do like him. Why are you calling him hot in your head? Why are you saying that you want to see him again? Like, I know you're a liar. I know that you two aren't really enemies, but with these two, it's like, okay, they're enemies for like a bit. Emily Henry didn't drag it out for longer than it needed to be. Like, they clearly were attracted to each other. They were clearly flirting with each other. The banter between those two, like the flirtatious banter, the back and forth. Nora, the main character, is like, she is tall, she is ambitious, she's very blunt, she's very high maintenance, she wears heels, she wears makeup. Like, all of these things are usually the character that is usually playing the ex of the main guy is what Nora is. Despite the fact that she was all these things, I feel like the main love interest loved those things about her. Like, the things that people usually make her feel really shit about are the things that he really appreciated about her. And he was so witty. He was one of only 2 book crushes I've ever had. Like, full-on book crushes I've ever had. And I will talk about my #1 MCM in a second. Anyway, highly recommend, absolutely love it. Now, the next book I will talk about is one I read like so close to the beginning of the year. It's a series and I couldn't pick between the last 2 books. Like, I didn't know which one to mention, but I'm gonna mention both of them. Blue Lily Blue and Raven King, and this is part of the Raven Boys. This is a YA fantasy series. And first of all, I started this journey maybe 2020, I think that's when I read Raven Boys, and then I read the second book, Dream Thieves, in 2021, and then I read these 2 this year, back to back, because I love them both so much. So anyway, let me tell you a bit about Raven Boys. So it's about these 4 boys who go to a private school and they're besties. There's this guy called Adam, he's poor and he's on a scholarship. He's going through his own struggles at home. And then there's Gansey, who's like the leader of the squad, and they all really respect him, and he's quite arrogant and he's really rich. And there's this other guy called Ronan. If you haven't heard me speak about Ronan, I absolutely love him. He's the love of my life. Anyway, Ronan is like this, I don't want to say emo, but he's very like to himself, very angry with the world, and he has this little pet raven and he's just so cute. Okay. Noah, who is the absolute sweetest guy in the whole entire world. So those 4 are like best friends, and they go to this private school that is known for having a lot of super rich boys who are super snobby. And then there's this girl called Blue, who grew up in a family of tarot readers and all very witchy, very like free-spirited, very fun. She's just surrounded by all these women, and then she somehow, in an unlikely scenario, ends up being friends with these guys. At first she hates them, with good reason. Gansey's an absolute prick, and I remember I hated him at the start because he was just so arrogant, but then you just see her morph into this friendship group, and it is so amazing. The only reason I think the first 2 books in the series were 4.5 stars for me, they were so long to get into. I feel like they were just so description heavy, and like nothing was happening. Absolutely nothing was happening until like the last third of each book. So I was like, what's going on here? I absolutely love it, but obviously I couldn't give it 5 stars because I was like, it wasn't hooking me from the beginning. And then I read these 2 books. I already absolutely love the first 2 books, but these 2 have made this one of my favourite series of all time. I love it. Like, these books have so many beautiful moments between these friends. Actually, I want to pull up a quote for you because this really describes their friendship. Blue was perfectly aware that it was possible to have a friendship that wasn't all-encompassing, that wasn't blinding, deafening, maddening, quickening. It was just that now that she'd had this kind, she didn't want the other. They just like love each other so much, and all of their relationships, everything is just so beautiful. And also these 2 books have plot too. Like, I feel like they were interesting. They pick up right from the beginning. This also has one of the best romances I've ever read, like my favorite romance of all time. It's just so worth reading. Like, if you're reading that first book and you're like, nothing's happening, this is so slow, like, give it a chance, especially if you're a character driven reader, because these characters are everything. Even like now, I couldn't explain the plot to you. I really couldn't explain. Like, I know these 2 have plot in them, but I just don't know what it was. Like, it was just so random and wacky. Like, you just have to go with it, okay? But these characters are amazing. I absolutely love them. So anyway, those are my favourite books of 2022. And don't forget to join us for the read-along, okay? Be there. Those are all the books. Hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you went away with a recommendation. Let me know one of your favourite books of the year that I should definitely read. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.